Now we'll pass on to Neil Thorns. Alok, can you share? Yes. Neil Thorns is the Director of Advocacy and Communications at CAFOD, Caritas England and Wales. His work is to influence the root causes of the poverty which CAFOD's partner organizations are facing and involves policy, lobbying, and campaigns at a national and international level. He was appointed to the Ecological Task Force of Pope Francis' COVID Commission and has been part of the Vatican delegation to COP. He has previously held roles at British Red Cross and Christian Aid, amongst others, and is a master's in politics and economy of South Africa. To you, a very warm welcome, Neil Thorns, and then we'll listen to you.
Thank you very, excuse me. Thank you very much. I just have a PowerPoint to show, so let me just ping this up. So thank you. It's always lovely to be here. It feels like another year has come around when this course comes up, and it's lovely to see everyone on here. Thank you for joining, and thank you for all the organisation to all of the people who've brought us together today. I'm going to talk a bit more about the kind of practical elements, if you like, about how we might do the lines of approach and action in this after that wonderful reflections and input from Erin there. So I'm going to really talk about kind of three areas which I think bring together the chapter 5 of Laudato Si in terms of the lines of action and approach. So I'm going to talk about the climate crisis, nature and poverty, and how those three things are very much interlinked. And I'm going to talk about 3 international treaties underneath those. I'm going to talk about finance, because finance, sadly, is absolutely critical to making everything happen, and maybe how we can deal with the issue of where's the money in today's world. And then maybe a bit of reform and hope at the end, just to kind of finish us off. Which I think hopefully takes us into some key, very concrete spaces, which we can really bring those lines of approach and action into being. Oops. So the first thing I think to say is that obviously the climate crisis, nature and poverty are very interlinked, and that's one of the wonderful things in which Pope Francis brings forward in Laudato Si. And he also has this wonderful quote in Laudato Deum where he says, "To the powerful I can only repeat this question: what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so?" And I think there are a number of ways in which we can take action, and I will just outline some of them. So the first one is the Paris Agreement. So the Laudato Si, as we know, was released in 2015. And at the same time, these treaties came into place. So the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Anyway, there's a more complicated story around that, but essentially it existed and it was there as well. And I think the important thing about these treaties are that they are bottom up. So I'm going to say that a few times when we talk about this. So they are all bottom up. So that means that we all have an opportunity to influence what our country does on these 3 key elements to bring about integral ecology, which Pope Francis talks about. So within those 3 treaties, there are over 250 commitments which governments have agreed to, which were hard won, which were agreed on a consensus basis. Governments negotiating, and they brought them about. And there's 250 commitments due by 2030. Now, sadly, most of those are off course, but that doesn't mean that they can't be still pushed forward and really made a difference on. And even though the situation is looking bleak, you know, we currently in the UK are in a heat wave, and 2024 was the first calendar year to pass that symbolic 1.5 degree threshold that scientists say we must stay below if we are going to keep some semblance of protection from the climate crisis. and it was the world's hottest on record. But the 1.5-degree target, as under the Paris Agreement, hasn't yet been broken because that's an average over decades. And so that's what we need to make sure. We need to keep our progress on keeping down that 1.5-degree temperature rise, as it's really critical. So those three international treatments all have national level plans, which I'm going to talk about. They're off track, but we can do something about them. So two key issues which bring together the issue of poverty and climate, which are really important when we start looking into the detail of the lines of attack or lines of action that we should take. And the first one is adaptation, and the second one is loss and damage. So these are climate terms. So very obviously, adaptation is about how communities are able to adapt to the climate crisis in front of them. So the first one is mitigation. How do you stop the temperature levels going up? The second one is adaptation. So how are you able to adapt to the situation which is affecting you as a community, as a country, and as a world? And then the third thing is loss and damage. So when you can't adapt, when you can no longer adapt to the high temperature levels, the increasingly erratic weather situations, you're into a situation of loss and damage. And therefore, how do communities, rich communities like the UK, who have caused the climate crisis, how are we enabling countries to support themselves when they're into that situation of loss and damage? And that's really critical. Now, those two things, plus the mitigation, you can all find in a number of really helpful trackers and spaces going forward. So if you kind of want to say, well, I want to know what the UK has done. So every country will have put together what they call a nationally determined contribution, an NDC. And that NDC is part of the Paris Agreement. So it's back to this bottom-up approach. They also have a national adaptation plan. So again, every country under the Paris Agreement should have a national adaptation plan. Equally, under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, there are national commitments to that Sustainable Development Goal transformation. And lastly, but not leastly, the national biodiversity strategies and action plans under the Convention of Biological Diversity Treaty. So all of these are available to us and the links are there. So you can see what your country is doing and you're able to therefore influence. So it's back to that thing of this is the basis upon which you then engage with your elected representatives, your local representatives, whoever it is, and you can come together in your communities, in your parishes, with other organisations to start to influence about a more ambitious approach which your government might have, or to hold them to account for how much money is coming in through these through international finance, how you're holding them to account about how they're spending that. So they're really important and it's quite transparent. So those are the kind of international treaties which are there and the spaces in which you can understand what's happening. The other thing I would mention is there was, I'm sure people will be familiar, there was a Santa Marta conference which happened recently. And this is kind of happening outside of those treaties. So it was talked about at the last COP, but it's a really important process for that point which Aaron was making earlier about how do you take the world off fossil fuels? How do you take us off our dependency of it? And that was a really important meeting. And out of that, countries agreed plans to essentially develop national roadmaps away from fossil fuels and along with tools to address the harmful subsidies, because we know that more subsidies go into fossil fuels than anything else. And so to take us off that carbon intensive trade. You can read all about the conference, what came out. It's going to be an annual conference. So next year, Tuvalu and Ireland are going to be the co-hosts as we go forward. And importantly, there was a manifesto of the churches from the Global South, and it was called Towards Peace, with creation and urgent call for transition beyond fossil fuels. And that was issued by the Episcopal Conferences of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and also supported by Europe as well. So really important that that's happening. So at the heart of most of this stuff comes back down to finance. Because if you are a country who are suffering from the climate crisis, if you are a country who is high levels of poverty, if you are trying to deal with the nature crisis, you need finance to be able to deal with that. And I think Pope Francis named one of the key aspects of this in the Jubilee year last year. And he said, a heartfelt appeal that I would make in the light of the coming Jubilee to the more affluent nations is that I ask them to acknowledge the gravity of so many of their past decisions and determine to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them. And he says it's not a question of generosity, it's a question of justice. And that's really important because we are living in a global debt crisis. And why that is so important is because A, we don't have to be living in a global debt crisis. And B, 93% of the countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis are either in debt distress or significant risk of it. So that means countries are not able to finance their adaptation, or they're not able to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis, which we know is getting more and more every year. So it's really important that we do something about this finance. And because we need a lot of money in the next coming years. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has calculated the sum of money that developing countries will need could be up to 5.9 trillion before 2030. And what's the choice there? The choice is, do we want to default on the debts that we owe, which are unfair, or do we want to default on the development, which we know is so critical in giving people lives, giving people those sustainable lives? So the finance is really, really important, and we have an unfair financial system, and that's why countries in the global south have to borrow money at a much higher level than, for example, in the UK. And that's why some of the unfair debts, which are held in the UK, continue to be because of that power imbalance. You can see on this graph, I won't go through all of the details, but essentially the debt crisis has risen. And there's a big chunk in the middle, which is the kind of lightest blue, and that's the private creditors. And that's what's changed. Many of us will remember Jubilee 2000, and there was a big campaign to cancel debt. And actually what's changed is the nature of that debt has changed, and the private creditors now hold most of that. And that's for countries like the UK and the US to do something about, to make sure that those private creditors come to the table alongside other people. So we have a number of debt asks, and these debt asks are specific to changing the issue of debt and releasing that money so that countries are able to spend it themselves. And there are a number of ways which we can do that. I won't go through all of them here, but for us in the north, it's really important to be able to holding our own countries to account. But it's also important for global south countries to be able to make sure that when that money comes through from debt relief or debt servicing, that money goes to the most important bits. And that's back to tracking those plans around national adaptation plans, the NDCs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the ones around Convention for Biological. And I think what's important here is previously, so as we know, the financial system is very much weighted towards those rich countries. But we are seeing slight areas of hope, which is important. So for example, there's a borrowers club going to be set up. So previously there's been a club which has been for those people who lend the money. And now there's going to be a thing called a borrowers club. And that's really important because it brings together those countries who borrow that money. And borrowing is a good thing. Every country needs to borrow money to be able to invest in the essential infrastructure or the services for people that we need. But you have to do it fairly and you have to do it accountably. And so the borrowers club gives a bit more weight to those borrowers in pushing back on some of that financial system going forward. So that's a positive. So the other aspects of where the money's coming from, and again, Laudato Si, wonderful. Today, in view of the common good, there is an urgent need for politics and economics to enter into a frank dialogue in the service of life, especially human life. Absolutely important that economics should serve the people, not itself. And so again, I've listed 3 areas whereby actually if we change our financial system, it brings out what, in a sense, Laudato Si wants to do. So you can change the global tax architecture. You can start thinking about tax on extreme wealth. We see that inequality is growing across the world greater than ever before. So that is a really important thing, and that's one of the things which Pope Leo mentioned in his recent encyclical. We can have progressive taxes on polluting activities. We know that's a good way of stopping them and also making them pay for their the sins, if you like, that they have caused from the climate crisis. So that's maritime shipping, frequent flyer levies, private jet levies, and of course taxes on fossil fuel extraction. So there's a whole bank of stuff around taxation which releases money but also stops that kind of polluting industries. Second thing about resolving the debt crisis, I've talked about that already. And importantly, the third one is about reforming financial institutions. The World Bank and the IMF are there to support the global economy and especially to support those countries which need it most. And they need to operate better in terms of doing that. And they can do that. They can release more money if they change the way that they operate and their governance structures to bring more of the global South countries on there, to make them more democratic and less dominated by the rich countries such as the UK. And I'm coming to an end now. This is the last slide. I kind of called it the year of action, but I think there's lots that we can always do when it comes to this. So we've had some wonderful inputs over the last period. So Laudato Si obviously was wonderful, and all the encyclicals which have come and messages that we've heard from Pope Francis and Pope Leo since. We've also started having messages from the Episcopal conferences. So I mentioned one earlier about Santa Marta, but also the Episcopal conferences, SECAM, SELAMs, FABCs. They did a wonderful message for COP30 called A Call for Climate Justice and the Common Home. Ecological Conversion, Transformation and Resistance to False Solutions. It's a wonderful document. There is also the encyclical which Pope Leo just released, or was just published. And in that, I'm sure we'll have all have read it, but in it, he says, just pulled out one thing, where he says about the current AI systems require enormous amounts of energy and water, significantly influencing carbon dioxide emissions, and place heavy demands on natural resources. So that's just one element. He also obviously talks about the inequality that AI can bring forward. And we've talked before about how that inequality is growing, both in terms of wealth, but also in terms of technological property. So there's a lot of resources out there in which to influence. And those national plans, which we can all track, are a good places to start and to use the voices and the messaging that we get from these. And the last thing I will flag is there is a global stocktake, and it's really important. So COPs, the climate talks, come in waves. The next global stocktake happens in 2028, so that's COP33. But it starts this year, and it's really important to be able to influence our own countries so that actually when that global stocktake happens, there are ambitious plans presented on the table in 2028 so that government, all of those things can be brought together and they can be looked at and said, yes, this is a response worthy of Laudato Si and all the other faith traditions and all of the other activities that actually countries are doing. So it's really important as we think about this, the global stocktake on a national level, which builds up into those international spaces. I've got some resources on this. The PowerPoint is always shared afterwards. So all of those links there are available to you. And any questions that you have, very happy to answer now or afterwards. Thank you very much.